and welcome back. Today we're going to cover part 2 of our Sleep Good series. Last week we covered sleep cycles and things to do with your circadian rhythm and sleep pressure. This week we're going to do a bit of a shift into the different types of sleep and what actually kind of occurs and happens during, the time when you're not awake, and, the different benefits that are being bestowed at different stages of sleep. So to kind of move into it, there's two main ones that you're already probably aware of, but if you're not, I'll cover them right now. So there's NREM sleep, so N-R-E-M, and then there's REM sleep, R-E-M. And what those stand for are non-rapid eye movement and rapid eye movement. As you can imagine, it's pretty self-explanatory. When you're in the non-REM stage, pretty much there's no eye movement going on underneath your eyelids. But however, in the REM stage, there is rapid eye movements going back and forth. Kind of like if you've seen my videos, how you might have noticed that my eyes actually shape back and forth because I have this thing called nystagmus. So it's a similar kind of thing like that, but obviously it's happening while you're asleep, unlike me where it happens all the time. I'm just that special. Now, it's important to know, and I think this is where we should start off when it comes to what's happening in those two different stages. It's probably best to start out with the one that happens first, which is NREM sleep, which is the non-rapid eye movement, and kind of what's happening in the brain during that time. But to understand that, we actually need to start off with what's happening when it comes to your kind of brain waves and the electrical kind of firings going on in your brain when you're awake. So when you're awake, your brain waves or the electrical kind of like pulses going through it are like going crazy. Like there's so many happening per second that it's just like there's no distinct rhyme or rhythm to it all. It's very frenetic and very not panicky, but like it's very distressed in the sense that a lot's going on. Like the Michael Walker guy, or Matthew Walker, or whatever the author's name is, he talks about how when he puts people into his sleep kind of research lab, and then they do all the brain recordings, and then what they can do is they can actually do this thing where they convert the brainwave feed or data or whatever you want to call it. They can actually play it like through audio. They can actually convert that to an audio sound and then play that. And what they said is, during that time, it's crazy. It just doesn't seem to make any sense. But the difference when you go into NREM sleep is that your brain waves really slow down and they start to spread out a lot more. So there actually kind of will be a bit of a rhythm, and that's what he says is like, if you were to play it, you could actually kind of, tap along with the kind of rhythm of the brain waves. Like there'd be a sound, like he said that there'd, be additional sounds popping in and out, every once in a while, but not as crazy as what it would be while you're awake. And the important thing about NREM sleep, and what it's trying to do is, it's best to think of it at that stage as kind of like a data backup stage or a data transfer stage of your kind of sleep. So you store up all of these early memories like this in your short-term memory, and what NREM sleep does is it allows your brain to transfer that information kind of from your brain's short-term memory banks to other parts of the brains, or other parts of the brains. Well, shit, how many brains do you have? That's more concerning. But to different parts of the brains, which, oh God, I said it again, brains, jeez. And I'm not cutting it out either. We're just going to roll with this. This is how these things work. We just go live. We do it in one take because we are professionals. So it takes it to different parts of your brain and into long-term memory banks that allow you to kind of like hold on to those memories for longer, and you'll be able to recall them later. And we'll cover some of the benefits, in more detail in later videos, but I'm just trying to basically explain the process of how sleep works while you're asleep, and we'll go over more of the benefits later. Think of it in this process almost like the difference between an AM and a FM frequency radio. So FM has a much more higher pitch, or higher wavelength, or whatever you want to call it, so it goes up and down. So it's the difficulty with that is it's a trade-off more than anything else. It can send higher quality information, but it can only send it a shorter distance. So I don't know if you've ever done any long like road trips. What you'll notice is when you drive out of the cities and go kind of to more regional and rural areas, is a lot of the FM radio stations will slowly drop out one by one as you kind of go out of their transmitting radius, because like I said, they can deliver more high quality info over a space, but it's a shorter space. Now with AM frequencies, it's got a longer kind of wavelength. It can't send as rich as information, but it can send it long distances. So like going back to that example with the regional driving or the rural driving, you'll actually be able to pick up AM stations for a lot longer than you would be, the FM radio stations. And to bring it back to what I was talking about with the brain, the reason why in NREM sleep you've got those like kind of longer wavelengths when it comes to your brain waves is because it's trying to send the information in your short-term memory banks into really far off kind of distances in your brain. And it needs to do that because if your short-term memory, you've only got so much of it. So if you kind of fill that up constantly, and this is what also happens when you're sleep deprived, when you have constantly filled it up and then you're adding new experiences, new memories, what ends up happening is it will delete things or overwrite things. Almost think of it like a USB. It will overwrite things with what's already there, with what's new. And obviously your brain doesn't want to do that, doesn't like that happening. So it sends the information that it's stored up during the day to the longer, almost hard drives, if we look at it like that, like in a computer sense. So, USB is your short-term memory, and then your big hard drive is, kind of your long-term memory banks. Now, moving on to REM sleep, which is the rapid eye movement one, is a weird kind of situation because your brain waves almost essentially go back to what it looks like when you're awake. And he talks about this and what it how can you tell if someone's asleep by looking at someone's brainwaves? If you're awake or in REM sleep, it looks pretty much identical. Like, how do you tell? And what he says is that the brain at that point is when it is kind of gone into its dreaming phase, and we'll cover this off later in later videos, or even maybe a little bit later in this video, where your body goes completely limp and it loses all of its muscle tone. The reason why it does this, and it's the brain's own doing, is because it doesn't want you to act out the things going on in your brain, like during your dreams, actually out in the real world while you're obviously you're still asleep, but it doesn't want you, because all the same impulses and firing mechanisms are still going off in your brain while you're in REM sleep, but your body kind of puts you into this stasis mode where you just lock down and your body won't actually react to those impulses and electrical firings and stuff of neurons, because your body knows it would be dangerous to do that. And he kind of goes on to say that's probably developed due to us living in trees back in the back when we were monkeys down the whole evolutionary ladder. Because imagine if you're sleeping in a tree branch, if you're wriggling around a lot and at jumping and doing all sorts of crazy stuff while you're asleep, well, you're probably going to fall out of your tree and either not severely injure yourself or potentially kill yourself. So yeah, that's something that obviously nature and evolutionary biology has given to us because it's a great trait to have, I guess. But a thing about it is, and this is the worst part, is as you get older, that actually changes. Your body's ability to keep yourself locked down in that stasis state actually diminishes over time. So when you get in, let's just say, your 70s or 80s or 90s or whatever, your ability to do that will actually be a lot more restricted. So your body might actually act out some of the things going on in your dreams actually in real life, which is kind of concerning, because imagine if you're already old, so you're pretty frail, and if you jump out of bed, you might fall over and, hurt yourself pretty badly. But, what can you do? Now, the different stages and kind of what they represent, going from wakefulness to NREM sleep to REM sleep is, or what the author kind of brings forward is that the wakefulness moment, the days you're experiencing and when you're awake and doing things, your brain's absorbing all of this information and knowledge and memories and experience. And then when you move into the NREM sleep, what it's doing is it's going, okay, we've got all this information, let's send it off to our long-term storage so that, we can refer to it later. And then the purpose of the REM sleep is essentially to play out, to, take that information, that has just been added today, and then kind of combine it and mesh it with all of the experience and knowledge that you've built up over time and, throughout your life. And it pretty much goes through all these emotional and behavioral, movies pretty much, where it's trying to create and construct a model for the environment that you live in. It's trying to come up with, you can almost think of it like it's trying to come up with a strategy to survive within the conditions that you find yourself. And I think that's kind of really an interesting point, because, different people in different, landscapes or environments, depending whether it's modern or scavengers or something like that, obviously will prioritize different things based on their environment. And then that's what that REM sleep is doing. Every single component is important, getting the memories, storing them correctly, and then kind of experimenting with them, if you want to call it that. They're all important stages, but the last one, the REM sleep, actually gives you the capacity to kind of come up with those novel strategies to survive in your world, or whatever kind of environment is present to you. And the interesting thing about it is, you think, how do these different layers play out? And, do they fluctuate? Do they increase? Or do they stay static throughout your entire, sleep time? And this was a real eye-opener for me. And the next bit that I'm going to drop on you was a huge thing for me as well, that I was just like, whoa, this is something, and this is kind of like what prompted me to actually do this video series, was that the amount of NREM sleep and REM sleep changes over time. So over the let's just say average 7 to 8 hours that you're asleep, you kind of go through these 90-minute cycles, where you start out predominantly in your first cycle of sleep, you'll start out predominantly doing NREM sleep, so doing that memory storage stuff, which kind of makes sense. It's the first time you've dropped down into sleep, so it's trying to grab everything it can and put it into the storage, into the storage chamber as quickly as possible. And then on the tail end of that cycle, you get a bit of REM sleep. So let's say you maybe get 70 minutes of NREM sleep and then maybe 20 minutes of REM sleep in that first kind of sleep cycle. But as you go along and, 90 minutes comes, and you go for the next 90-minute cycle and the next 90-minute cycle after that, what ends up happening throughout the night, the proportion of NREM sleep to REM sleep changes. You actually will, by the late and early morning, you'll actually be doing a lot less NREM sleep and doing far much more REM sleep, which makes sense, because if you've already gotten, at the beginning of your sleep, you've already gotten a lot of your information from your short-term memory banks into your long-term kind of storage location, it makes sense that would give you the freedom to then experiment with it. So what he says is that, if you think you can cut off an hour, maybe an hour and a half each night, let's say you get 6.5 hours of sleep, or even worse, 6 hours of sleep, you might actually think that that's okay. But what he says is that you're actually cutting off some of the most core components of your sleep, which is that REM sleep. Not saying that NREM sleep isn't important, but that rapid eye movement stage is incredibly important, like I said, for just being able to almost enmesh that information with who you are. And all the sleep isn't made equal, and you might think, what sleep is more important? If you were sleep deprived, which sleep will your body preference over the other? What do you actually need to survive? And the irony is that, not irony, but I guess the interesting thing is that if you were to go an all-nighter, like how we talked about last episode, over the following nights, when you do finally go to bed, your body will disproportionately, even more than normal, throughout the whole sleep, or let's say the whole 6 to 8 hours, the whole time, for a lot more of the whole time, it will actually preference NREM sleep. And then over the coming days, what will happen is it will then shift more predominantly to REM sleep. So what that kind of tells us is that for basic survival, your body will actually preference NREM sleep when it can, right at the start. When it gets the first opportunity to sleep, it will preference NREM sleep because, like I said, it makes sense. It's trying to get rid of all the memory in the short-term memory banks and take it to the long one. But then after a while, what it will do is it will try and catch up on all the REM sleep that you missed out, all of the, like incorporating of that information, it will try and catch up on that. But here's the last point, which was really kind of terrifying. And obviously there's probably more details that he'll expand on this, especially with the current chapter I'm reading about sleep deprivation and stuff like that, is when you get a bad night's sleep, or when you don't get enough sleep, or if you go an all-nighter or something like that, the sleep deficit or the effect of that sleep deficit that you've built up can never be fully recovered. He said it's one of the worst things, and one of the most eye-opening things for me, that I found out that when you're getting bad sleep, you actually can never fully recover from that, which is terrifying when I think about some of the times in my past over, years, like even a decade, all the times I've done all-nighters or gotten terrible sleep, and it's kind of, concerning. Or, I think to myself, man, what kind of damage has that done to my body over time when you add it all up? And so I found that very concerning. So he honestly says that you should you should be getting at least 7, but ideally 8 hours of sleep. Because if you're not, like I said, you'll be cutting off some of the most rich, high quality sleep if you're, sacrificing or cutting your sleep down by an hour or so. You're actually losing some of the best high quality sleep you can get. And like with that last point I made, it builds up over time. So those effects, and we'll actually talk about that in the next video, will kind of play out to have negative consequences, not just for you, but potentially others. Yeah, so get your sleep. And he doesn't recommend using, sleeping pills. He has other strategies, and I'll go through them in a later video on, how we can kind of force ourselves or, encourage ourselves to have better sleep. But I'll kind of leave that here for now. Just to give a basic outline of how I'm going to do this series is, I've still got a number of videos planned, but the last one I'm going to do is going to kind of be this one where we're going to go through how sleep changes throughout your life, how, when you're in early childhood, this is what kind of typical sleep patterns will kind of look like, and then, moving on to adolescence, adulthood, and then, to old age. So we'll kind of cover the time spectrum, but I wanted to get all this information of, the sleep cycles, the process of sleep, all the positives and negatives, before I then went through the details of how sleep can affect you, or what stage of sleep you might be in when it comes to your age, and how that's going to be affecting you. So leave it here for now. Thank you so much for, watching, and if you could, leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.